Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. It waits, patient and silent, until someone's brave enough to dig it up. The morning mist hung heavy over the Montana woods when Milo started barking. Not his usual alert bark when deer crossed their path, but something primal, desperate. David Thompson gripped his coffee mug tighter, watching his German shepherd pace frantically around the ancient oak tree that marked the edge of his property. Milo had never acted like this. In 8 years together, the dog had faced down bears without flinching. Now he whimpered, hackles raised, backing away from the massive tree trunk, as if it harbored something evil. David approached slowly, his retired detective instincts prickling. The oak showed an unnatural bulge 6 feet up, roughly the size of a grown man. Dark sap wept from cracks in the bark, releasing a smell that made his stomach turn. Not the clean scent of pine resin, but something organic and wrong. Milo's Sophia eyes locked onto his. Pleading warning. David reached for his old police knife, knowing some secrets the earth keeps for 15 years. Others, it's ready to give up. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. David Thompson had built his life around routine. At 58, the former Cedar Falls police detective rose each morning at 6, brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and walked the perimeter of his 10-acre property with Milo by his side. The ritual had kept him sane through the worst years of his life. Cedar Falls, Montana, population 3,200, was a kind of place where everyone knew your business before you did. David had served the community for 30 years, earning respect as a detective who never gave up on a case. But that was before Rose lost her battle with cancer 6 years ago. Before Emma died in that twisted metal wreck on Highway 2. 15 years back, just 16 years old and full of dreams. Milo had been Amelia's dying wish. Get a dog, Daddy, she'd whisper from her hospital bed, machines beeping around her like electronic mourners. Dogs don't leave you. David found Milo at the county shelter 3 months later, a German shepherd puppy with intelligent Sophia eyes that seemed to understand grief. The cabin sat 5 miles outside town, surrounded by towering pines and ancient oaks. David had built it with his own hands after Rose's funeral, needing distance from the sympathetic looks and whispered conversations that followed him through the streets of Cedar Falls. Out here, only Milo witnessed his bad days, when the bottle called louder than common sense, when the silence pressed so heavy he could barely breathe. Milo wasn't just a pet. He was family. The dog possessed an intelligence that sometimes unsettled visitors, though David had grown accustomed to feeling understood by his four-legged companion. Milo knew when the nightmares came, padding silently to David's bedside in the dark hours before dawn. He knew when the anniversary dates approached, staying closer than usual, as if sensing his master's need for comfort. The German shepherd had never shown fear. Not when black bears wandered through their yard. Not during thunderstorms that shook the cabin's foundation. Not even when the occasional drunk from town stumbled onto their property looking for trouble. Milo faced everything with calm courage, always positioning himself between David and any perceived threat, which made this morning's behavior so deeply unsettling. The ancient oak had stood sentinel on the property line for over a century, its massive trunk scarred by lightning and weather but enduring. David had walked past it thousands of times without incident, but something had changed. The unnatural bulge in its trunk seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and Milo's primal terror suggested they'd stumbled onto something that had been waiting patiently in the darkness, ready to surface after years of concealment. David approached the oak tree with a methodical caution that had kept him alive through 3 decades of police work. Milo retreated to a safe distance, ears flat, every muscle radiating tension. The German shepherd distress was so profound that David felt his own heart rate spike in response. The bulge in the tree's trunk was roughly 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, stretching the ancient bark until deep fissures opened like wounds. Dark resin seeped from these cracks, but the substance didn't smell like normal tree sap. It carried an organic odor that reminded David uncomfortably of the moor during his early days on the force. He pulled the folding knife from his pocket, a tool he'd carried since his first day as a patrol officer 35 years ago. The blade was still sharp, maintained with the same attention to detail that had defined his entire career. David positioned himself carefully, aware that Milo's continued agitation meant they weren't alone in these woods. The first cut into the bark released a stronger wave of that wrong smell, causing Milo to whimper and back even further away. David had learned long ago to trust his partner's instincts, whether that partner walked on 2 legs or 4. He paused, scanning the tree line for any sign of watchers, then made a deeper incision. Fabric emerged from the cut. Old fabric, darkened with age and moisture, but clearly recognizable as clothing. David's blood chilled as he realized what he was looking at. Someone had been sealed inside this tree, and the wood had grown around them over the years, creating a natural tomb. His hand shaking slightly, David widened the opening. More cloth became visible, along with something metallic that caught the morning light. With growing horror, he recognized the gleam of a badge, a police badge. David stepped back from the tree, his breath coming in short gasps. In all his years of law enforcement, he'd seen plenty of death, but this discovery hit him with unexpected force. Someone had been murdered and hidden here, possibly years ago, and the killer had counted on the tree's growth to conceal their crime forever. Milo's barking intensified, no longer directed at the tree, but toward the forest beyond. David spun around, hand instinctively reaching for the service weapon he no longer carried. Through the undergrowth, he caught a glimpse of movement. Someone was out there, watching. The metallic object in the tree wasn't just any badge. As David forced himself to look closer, despite every instinct screaming at him to run, he could make out the familiar shield shape of the Cedar Falls Police Department. The number was partially obscured by debris, but enough digits were visible to send ice through his veins. Badge number 804. Detective Jackson Morrison. David sat heavily on a fallen log, the knife slipping from nerveless fingers. Jackson had been his partner for 8 years, his best friend, the closest thing to a brother he'd ever had. Jackson had disappeared 15 years ago while working a case, vanishing without a trace during what was supposed to be a routine investigation. The department had searched for weeks. The FBI had been called in, but no sign of Jackson Morrison was ever found. The official conclusion was that Jackson had met with an accident in the wilderness, possibly falling into a ravine or getting lost in the vast Montana forests. His body was presumed to be somewhere in the millions of acres surrounding Cedar Falls. Eventually, the search was called off. Jackson's wife, Helen, had waited 5 years before having him declared legally dead. But Jackson hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered, and someone had taken great care to ensure his body would never be found. The tree had been younger 15 years ago, small enough that someone could have hollowed out a space in the trunk and placed Jackson's body inside, then waited for nature to do the rest. David forced himself to stand, approaching the tree again despite Milo's low growls. Using a small flashlight from his pocket, he peered into the cavity his cuts had opened. Jackson's service weapon was there, along with what looked like a notebook or journal. The killer had placed everything inside the tree, turning Jackson's final resting place into a macabre time capsule. The sound of an approaching vehicle made both David and Milo freeze. A patrol car was coming up the dirt road to his cabin, moving slowly, deliberately. David quickly gathered the evidence he could reach, stuffing Jackson's badge and notebook into his jacket pockets. He couldn't let whoever was coming see what he discovered, not until he knew who to trust. Milo bounded to his side as a patrol car came into view through the trees, his protective instincts in full force, positioning himself between David and any potential threat. David recognized the vehicle as belonging to the Cedar Falls Sheriff's Department, but he couldn't yet make out who was driving. As the car pulled to a stop near his cabin, David felt the weight of Jackson's badge in his pocket like a burning coal. His best friend's murder had been covered up for 15 years, and now someone was coming to check on him just minutes after he'd uncovered the truth. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Someone knew he'd found Jackson's body. Someone had been watching, and that someone was about to step out of an official police vehicle, wearing a badge that might hide the heart of a killer. Deputy Carol Henry emerged from the patrol car with the calm, deliberate movements of someone who'd worn a uniform for more than a decade. David recognized her instantly. She'd joined the Cedar Falls force about 5 years ago, transferring from Billings with commendations for her work in narcotics. She was competent, thorough, and had always treated David with the respect due a veteran detective, even after his retirement. But today, something felt different. Milo's hackles stayed raised as she approached, his Sophia eyes tracking her every move with a focused intensity that made David's stomach knot. The German shepherd had always been friendly with Henry during her previous visits to check on him. Now, he stood rigidly between David and the deputy, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "Morning, David," Henry called out, her hand resting casually on her duty belt. "Got a call about a disturbance out here. Neighbor reported hearing what sounded like gunshots about an hour ago." David felt Jackson's badge burning like a live coal against his ribs where he tucked it inside his jacket. There weren't any neighbors within 3 miles of his cabin, and Henry knew it. She was fishing, probing, trying to see what he might have discovered. "No gunshots here, Carol," David replied, keeping his tone steady despite the adrenaline thrumming through his veins. "Milo and I were just taking our morning walk. You know how sound carries in these woods. Probably a hunter up the ridge." Henry's eyes swept the clearing, lingering on the disturbed earth near the oak tree. "Mind if I take a look around?" "Protocol, you understand. Gotta file a complete report." Milo's growl deepened, and a chill crawled up David's spine. In all the years he'd known Henry, she'd never been this formal with him. They'd shared coffee on his porch, talked shop, laughed about department politics. Now, she was treating him like a suspect. "Of course," David said casually, stepping away from the tree, "though I'm not sure what you expect to find." Milo was probably just chasing a squirrel or something. You know how dogs get excited. As Henry moved closer to the oak, David noticed her right hand never strayed far from her sidearm. The observation triggered his old detective instincts. His mind began cataloging every detail with practiced precision. Her patrol car was parked at an angle that blocked the main access road. Her radio volume was turned down low, unusual for an active call, and she hadn't radioed in her arrival. Standard protocol for a welfare check was clear. Announce location, confirm status. She hadn't done either. Milo refused to leave David's side despite Henry's attempts to coax him over with her usual friendly tone. The dog's protective stance was absolute, his training as David's companion overriding years of socialization. "Milo seems a bit agitated today," Henry observed, crouching near the base of the oak. "Everything okay with him?" "Just one of those days," David said, watching her closely. "Sometimes he gets spooked by scents we can't detect. Probably an old animal carcass nearby." Henry straightened, brushing dirt from her knees, and David caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. Tucked into her duty belt, half hidden beneath her jacket, was a small digital recorder. She was documenting their conversation. Not a welfare check, an interrogation. "David," she said finally, her voice adopting that careful, deliberate cadence he knew all too well from interrogation rooms. "I need to ask you something. You've been feeling okay lately? Some folks in town have been concerned. Living out here alone. Losing Rose and Emma the way you did. It's a lot for anyone." David recognized the tactic instantly. She was setting a narrative. The unstable retiree, prone to delusions. He'd used the same psychological approach 100 times himself. "I'm doing fine, Carol," he replied evenly. "Milo keeps me company. I stay busy with projects around the property. Is there something specific you're worried about?" Henry's hand drifted closer to her weapon. "We've had reports of someone digging around old crime scenes. Disturbing evidence. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" The question was a trap, designed to gauge his reaction, but it also revealed something crucial. She knew about Jackson's body in the tree. Maybe not that David had found it, but she was aware it existed. That meant she was either involved in Jackson's murder or working for someone who was. Milo suddenly stiffened, his gaze snapping toward the forest behind Henry's patrol car. David followed his line of sight. Movement in the undergrowth. They weren't alone. Backup. Henry had backup, waiting in the trees. "You know, Carol," David said slowly, "I think I'll make some fresh coffee. Why don't you come up to the cabin? It's getting cold out here." Henry hesitated, clearly weighing her options. David knew she wanted to see inside his cabin, to find out whether he'd taken anything from the crime scene or made contact with anyone. That sounds good, she said finally. I could use some coffee. As they walked toward the cabin, Milo kept himself between them, never letting Henry get behind David. The German shepherd's instincts screamed danger, and David had learned long ago to trust those instincts. Whatever this was, Carol Henry was at the center of it, and Jackson Morrison's 15-year-old murder was about to claim another victim, unless David figured out who to trust and how to survive the next few hours. The weight of Jackson's badge pressed against his chest like a burning promise. His best friend deserved justice, and David intended to see that he got it, even if it cost him everything. Inside the cabin, David moved with deliberate calm while his mind raced. He needed to buy time, gather information, and, most importantly, find a way to call for help without tipping his hand. Milo stationed himself near the kitchen doorway, eyes fixed on Henry as she scanned the interior with the careful gaze of someone assessing a scene. Nice place, she remarked, her fingers brushing across the mantel where photos of Rose and Emma stood. Must get lonely out here. When's the last time you had visitors? Another probe. She was testing whether he'd shared his discovery with anyone. Not many folks make the drive out here, David said, measuring coffee into the pot. Suits me fine. Henry picked up a framed photo of Emma, 16, smiling, full of life. She was beautiful. I heard she wanted to be a veterinarian. She loved animals, David said quietly, watching Milo's every movement. The dog's muscles were coiled, tense. He could sense danger David couldn't yet see. That's probably where you got the idea for Milo, Henry said, setting down the frame. Emma would have loved him. She did, David replied, pouring 2 cups of coffee. Actually, she suggested I get a dog. Said they don't leave you. Henry accepted the cup, but didn't drink. She just held it, warming her hands. Smart girl, she murmured. Dogs are loyal. They don't betray trust the way people do. The edge in her tone made David glance up sharply. Henry was studying him with unsettling intensity, not conversation, but assessment, measuring his reactions, calculating. Speaking of loyalty, she continued, settling into a chair across from him. I've been thinking about Jackson Morrison lately. You two were close, weren't you? David felt the badge burn against his ribs. Jackson was a good partner, a good friend. His disappearance hit the department hard. 15 years is a long time, Henry said, sipping her coffee but never breaking eye contact. People wonder what really happened to him, whether he just walked away, started over. Jackson would never abandon Helen and the kids. David said firmly, whatever happened to him, it wasn't voluntary. Henry's smile was thin and knowing. How can you be so sure? People change. Maybe he got tired of the job, the responsibility. Maybe he found something more appealing than small-town police work. The insinuation was clear. She was casting doubt on Jackson's integrity. Jackson was as honest as they come, David said coldly. If someone's suggesting otherwise, they're lying or they've got something to hide. Henry set her cup down hard, the sharp click echoing through the cabin. That's an interesting perspective. Very loyal. But loyalty can be dangerous, David. Sometimes it blinds us to uncomfortable truths. Milo suddenly rose, growling low, staring out the kitchen window. David followed his gaze, and his blood ran cold. Dark shapes moved among the trees, closing in around the cabin. Henry had brought backup, and they were sealing off every escape. Expecting company? She asked, her voice almost teasing. Just Milo being Milo, David said, forcing calm as his hand drifted toward the drawer where his old service weapon rested. He gets nervous when strangers are around. Henry's hand dropped to her sidearm. Strangers? I don't see any strangers. The pretense was over. David could see it in her eyes. The time for games had passed. She knew he'd found Jackson's body, and she was here to make sure that secrets stayed buried. You know, David, Henry said softly, standing from her chair, I think we need to have a more honest conversation about what you found this morning, about what you think you know. David stayed seated, outwardly calm, even as his mind calculated distances. The drawer was 3 feet away. Her gun was already in reach. Milo stood between them, muscles coiled, waiting for a signal. I'm not sure what you mean, David said. Henry pulled out her phone and turned the screen toward him. The photo showed David standing at the oak, cutting into the bark with his knife. Someone's been watching from the woods, she said evenly. We've been monitoring this location for weeks, ever since we got intel that someone was poking around old cases, disturbing things that should stay buried. David felt the air go cold. How long have you known about Jackson? Henry's expression hardened. Long enough to understand that some secrets are worth protecting. Jackson Morrison was getting too close to things that could have destroyed this entire community. Truth cuts deeper than any bullet. And tonight, David was about to find out just how deep corruption ran in Cedar Falls. David's anger simmered as he glared across the table. These were the people he'd been investigating. People who'd once worked hard to build something good here. Good. David's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. Jackson was murdered. My best friend was killed and stuffed inside a tree like garbage. You call that good? Henry's hand rested on her weapon now, no longer pretending this was a friendly visit. Jackson was going to expose operations that funded this department, she said coldly. He would have destroyed lives and careers over some misguided sense of justice. Justice isn't misguided, David replied, slowly rising from his chair. It's what separates us from the animals. Milo tensed, sensing the escalating danger. The German shepherd's training kicked in, positioning himself to protect his master while staying aware of threats from every direction. Animals are honest about what they are, Henry said. They don't pretend to be something they're not. Jackson pretended to be a crusader, but he was just naive and dangerous. David reached his moment of decision. He could continue the charade, pretend ignorance, and hope Henry would leave. But Milo's behavior told him the truth. They were surrounded. This conversation was a prelude to something far worse. Henry hadn't come to investigate a disturbance. She'd come to clean up a problem. Who killed him? David asked directly. Who put Jackson in that tree? Henry's smile was cold. Someone who understood that the greater good sometimes requires difficult choices. Someone who knew one man's life was a small price to pay to protect an entire community. The admission hung between them like a challenge. Henry had essentially confessed to knowing about Jackson's murder. If not direct involvement, David felt 15 years of grief and guilt pressed down on his shoulders. He'd failed his partner, his friend, and now he had a chance to make it right. Jackson had evidence, David said. Notes, recordings, proof of corruption. That's why he had to die. Evidence that would have destroyed good people, Henry replied. People using unconventional methods to fund essential services. Jackson couldn't see the bigger picture. David understood now. Jackson had uncovered a drug operation protected by local law enforcement. Profits funneled into department resources or personal accounts. When Jackson threatened to expose them, he was eliminated to protect the conspiracy. Where's the evidence now? David asked. Henry's smile widened. Safe. Secure. Where it can't hurt anyone else. Footsteps creaked on the porch outside. Henry's backup had arrived. Milo's hackles rose as he detected multiple people approaching from different directions. David realized with growing dread that he and Milo were trapped, surrounded by corrupt officers who'd already killed once to protect their secrets. You don't have to do this, David said quietly. Whatever Jackson found, whatever happened 15 years ago, it doesn't have to happen again. Henry drew her weapon, aiming it steadily at David's chest. Actually, it does. You found Jackson, and now you know too much, just like he did. Milo stepped forward, placing himself directly between the gun and his master. The dog's courage in the face of mortal danger reminded David of everything he'd ever learned about loyalty, sacrifice, and doing what's right, no matter the cost. The cabin door opened. 2 more figures entered. David recognized them instantly. Deputy Tom Bradley, and to his shock, Chief Robert Ethan himself. Hello, David, Ethan said softly. I wish it hadn't come to this. The chief closed the cabin door with deliberate care, the kind of motion that spoke of a plan rehearsed many times before. His weathered face bore the weight of 20 years in law enforcement, but his eyes held something else. The cold calculation of a predator cornering prey. You always were too thorough for your own good. Ethan said, removing his hat and setting it on the counter. Even in retirement, you can't stop being a detective. David felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Ethan had been his mentor, the man who'd guided him through his early years, who'd stood beside him at Rose's funeral, who'd offered comfort after Amelia's death. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. Thomas, David whispered, tell me you weren't involved in Jackson's death. Ethan sighed, the sound heavy with unwanted burdens. Jackson was my friend too, David. You think I wanted him dead? You think any of us did? Milo growled, low and constant, staying between David and the three officers. His instinct screamed danger. But you killed him anyway, David said, the truth falling into place like a guillotine. We tried to reason with him. Deputy Bradley blurted out. We explained how the money funded equipment, training, community programs. Jackson wouldn't listen. Enough, Ethan said, silencing him with a glance. Jackson discovered our arrangement. Money was changing hands, yes, but not for greed. Every dollar went back into making Cedar Falls better. Drug money. David said flatly, you were protecting dealers. We were managing an inevitable problem, Ethan corrected. Drugs were coming through this area no matter what. At least our arrangement made it controlled, predictable, and beneficial to the community. Henry shifted her weight, her gun still trained on David. That money-funded school computers, the senior center renovation, the Christmas toy drive. Jackson was going to destroy all of it for some abstract principle. David stared at Ethan in disbelief. You're justifying murder by talking about Christmas toys? I'm explaining reality, Ethan said calmly. Budgets were cut. Funding dried up. We found a way to survive without raising taxes or cutting services. Jackson wanted to throw that away. Jackson wanted to uphold his oath, David said, his voice shaking with fury. To protect and serve, not profit from crime. Ethan's expression hardened. And where did that oath get him? Dead at 34, leaving behind a widow and 2 kids. Sometimes idealism's a luxury we can't afford. Milo suddenly tensed, ears perked toward the rear window. David followed his gaze. Figures were moving in the forest. Ethan hadn't brought backup. He'd brought an army. The cabin was surrounded. How many are involved? David demanded. Enough, Ethan said coldly. People who understand the world isn't black and white. Sometimes good people make hard choices. David thought about the men and women he'd served beside for 3 decades. How many had been bought? How many had traded their souls for convenience? The corruption ran deeper than he'd ever imagined. Jackson had evidence, David said. Photos, recordings, documentation of everything. Destroyed, Ethan said. Most of it, anyway. We kept some as insurance, just in case anyone got curious. David's stomach turned. Ethan was confessing to murder with chilling indifference. The man who taught him about justice and integrity had become a killer to protect a criminal empire. The tree, David said slowly. That was your idea? Ethan nodded. Jackson loved these woods. He used to hunt here. It seemed fitting he should rest somewhere he found peace. You stuffed him inside a living tree, David said, trembling. We gave him a burial that would last forever, Ethan replied. The tree became his monument, keeping his secret safe. Milo growled as Ethan stepped closer. His loyalty was absolute. He would die for David, and everyone knew it. The question now, Ethan continued, is what we do about you. David's voice was steady. I won't let you bury the truth again. Jackson deserves justice. His family deserves the truth. Justice, Henry scoffed. Do you know what the truth would do to this town? Half the council, the mayor, the DA, all implicated. The whole system would collapse. Maybe it should, David shot back. Maybe starting over is better than living with corruption. You always were naive, Ethan said sadly. Just like Jackson. The world isn't good or evil, it's compromise. Murder isn't compromise, David said. It's wrong. Period. Jackson's death was necessary, Ethan said coldly. He would have destroyed everything we built. David looked around the cabin that had been his refuge, now filled with betrayal. He felt the weight of Jackson's badge pressing against his ribs, a symbol of promises broken. You're going to kill me too, David said. It wasn't a question. We'll ensure Jackson's secret stays buried, Ethan said. Your death will look tragic, but believable. A retired cop, overcome by grief, ended alone in the woods. Henry smirked. You've been isolated for years, David. Depressed, unstable. It won't surprise anyone. David realized they'd planned this for a long time, studying his habits, crafting a perfect cover story. They were going to use his pain as camouflage for murder. Milo barked sharply, turning toward the window. A distant rumble echoed from the access road. Ethan frowned. Check it, he ordered Bradley. As Bradley moved, David saw his chance. The distraction shifted the balance. Milo sensed it too, muscles coiling in anticipation. David looked at his loyal companion. Amelia's final gift, the dog who carried him through years of grief. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, words weren't needed. I'm sorry, boy, David whispered. The vehicle drew closer. Ethan's plan was unraveling. Someone was coming. Someone not part of conspiracy. The chief's face darkened. We need to move this along, he said, raising his weapon. David froze as he recognized the sound outside. The rumble of an old Ford pickup. His heart sank. Helen Morrison, Jackson's widow. Every month, she drove up here on the anniversary of Jackson's disappearance, leaving flowers where his patrol car was last seen. Ethan cursed under his breath. Bradley, turn her around. Tell her the road's closed. But it was too late. Helen's truck crested the hill. She'd already seen the police vehicles. Milo's barking intensified. The German shepherd moved between David and Ethan, hackles raised, teeth bared. Change of plans. Ethan growled, weapon steady. We'll stage it differently. A confrontation with an unstable retiree who found something about Jackson's disappearance. Helen arrives to find tragedy. David felt ice in his veins. Ethan intended to kill them both and frame it as a violent outburst tied to grief. She's innocent, David pleaded. Let her go. Helen's been asking questions for 15 years, Henry said. She's always been a problem. Through the window, David saw Helen step from her truck, confusion on her face as she spotted the police presence. She never gave up on him, David said. Jackson talked about her constantly, their dreams, their future. Jackson should have thought of that before playing hero. Ethan replied flatly, some people are more important than ideals. Milo suddenly lunged, not at Ethan, but toward the kitchen drawer where David kept his service weapon. The dog's intelligence was staggering. He understood the danger. Henry swung her gun toward Milo, but David moved faster than he had in years. Adrenaline surged. He dove for the drawer, fingers closing around a familiar grip at his Glock, just as gunfire erupted. Henry fired first, her bullet missing Milo as David's sudden movement threw off her aim. Wood splintered. Debris flew. Milo yelped but kept moving, dodging her next shot. David rolled behind the kitchen island, weapon in hand. 30 years of training took over. Fear vanished. Instinct ruled. Ethan fired twice, bullets punching through the island. You're only making this harder, David, he shouted. On yourself and on Helen. She'll die because of your pride. Outside, Helen screamed. Gunfire. Echoes across the Montana wilderness. Milo darted through the chaos like a shadow. His loyalty fierce, his movements precise. He wasn't just defending David. He was defending his family. Give up, David. Ethan shouted. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Don't make this worse. David thought of Emma, of her dying wish for him to get a dog. Milo had been more than that. He'd been salvation. Jackson trusted you. David yelled, trying to buy time. He looked up to you. How could you betray him like that? Jackson forced my hand. Ethan replied, voice filled with regret. I gave him every chance to walk away, to accept how things worked. Sometimes justice demands a sacrifice. And tonight, David would lose more than he ever imagined to find the truth. He chose ideology over pragmatism. Henry was moving to flank David's position, using the cover of overturned furniture to work her way around the kitchen island. David caught a glimpse of her reflection, in the stainless steel refrigerator and adjusted his position accordingly. Milo suddenly appeared behind Henry, moving with the silent grace of his wolf ancestors. The German shepherd launched himself at the deputy. 80 pounds of muscle and fury driven by absolute loyalty to his master. Henry spun toward the threat, but Milo was already inside her guard, his powerful jaws clamping down on her gun arm. She screamed as Milo's teeth found purchase, her weapon flying across the cabin floor. The German shepherd's attack created the distraction David needed. He rose from cover, his service weapon steady in a two-handed grip, the front sight centered on Ethan's chest. "Drop your weapon," David commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in law enforcement. "It's over, Thomas." Ethan hesitated, his gun wavering between David and Milo. The chief's face showed the calculation of a man weighing his options, searching for any angle to salvage his plan. That moment of hesitation cost him everything. Bradley, panicking at the chaos erupting around him, made the fatal mistake of trying to shoot Milo, while the dog was still engaged with Henry. The bullet meant for the German shepherd struck Henry in the shoulder, spinning her around and into Milo's path. The cabin erupted in violence. Milo, confused by Henry's fall and the smell of blood, redirected his protective fury toward the nearest threat. Bradley screamed as the German shepherd's training took over, the dog's powerful jaws seeking to neutralize the danger to his pack. In the chaos, Ethan made his final play, swinging his weapon toward David with deadly intent. But Milo, even in the midst of his attack on Bradley, somehow sensed a threat to his master. The German shepherd abandoned his target and threw himself between Ethan and David just as the chief's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot echoed to the cabin like thunder. Milo's body jerked as Ethan's bullet found its mark. The dog's momentum carried him into his master's arms. 80 pounds of loyal heart and protective spirit collapsing against David's chest. Blood immediately began seeping through Milo's thick coat, staining David's shirt with the life force of the only family he had left. "Milo, no," David whispered, catching a companion as the dog's legs gave out. The German shepherd Sophia's eyes found his master's face, still alert despite the grievous wound in his chest. Milo's tail gave one weak wag, as if to say he'd done his job. He protected his pack, and that was all that mattered. Ethan stood frozen, his smoking weapon still pointed at the spot where Milo had intercepted the bullet meant for David. For a moment, the cabin was utterly silent, except for Milo's labored breathing and the distant sound of Helen Morrison's screams outside. "You killed him," David said, his voice breaking as he pressed his hands against Milo's wound, feeling the dog's blood flowing warm between his fingers. "You killed the best of us." Ethan's face showed something David had never seen before, genuine remorse. The chief lowered his weapon slightly, staring at the wounded German shepherd with the expression of a man who'd finally crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "I didn't mean," Ethan started then stopped. The dog shouldn't have interfered. Milo's breathing was becoming more labored, each breath a struggle that sent waves of pain through David's heart. The German shepherd who'd pulled him back from the brink of despair after losing Rose and Emma was dying in his arms, another casualty of the corruption that had already claimed Jackson Morrison. Henry groaned from where she'd fallen, clutching her wounded shoulder. Bradley lay motionless near the overturned table, either unconscious or dead from Milo's attack. The cabin that had been David's sanctuary was now a battlefield littered with the cost of seeking justice. "Look what you've done," David said, his voice thick with grief and rage. "Look at the destruction you've caused, Thomas. Jackson, Milo, how many more people have to die to protect your dirty money?" Ethan seemed to age before David's eyes, the weight of 15 years of cover-ups, and compromises finally showing on his weathered features. "I never wanted any of this," Ethan said softly. "It started small, just looking the other way on minor infractions in exchange for community donations. It grew into something I couldn't control." "You could have stopped it," David accused, still pressing futilely against Milo's wound. "At any point, you could have chosen to do the right thing." "The right thing?" Ethan laughed bitterly. "Do you know what the right thing would have cost? Dozens of careers destroyed, families ruined, the community's trust in law enforcement shattered. I chose the lesser evil." Milo's eyes were growing glassy, but they remained fixed on David's face with the absolute trust that had defined their bond. From the day David brought him home from the shelter, Milo's loyalty had been unconditional, and even now, dying from a bullet meant for his master, he showed no regret for his sacrifice. You chose convenience over conscience, David said. You chose money over morality. And now you're adding murder to your list of sins. Outside, the sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of help. Helen Morrison's screams had carried far enough to alert other residents, and David could hear the distinctive wail of sirens growing closer. Ethan heard them too, his face hardened with resolve. This ends here, David. One way or another, it ends here. The chief raised his weapon again, pointing it directly at David's head. Stand up. Move away from the dog. David looked down at Milo, seeing the life fading from those intelligent Sophia eyes that had been his anchor through years of grief and loneliness. The German shepherd had given him everything: companionship, purpose, unconditional love, and now his life. David couldn't abandon him. Not now. No, David said simply. If you're going to kill me, you'll have to do it while I'm holding him. Ethan's hand trembled slightly as he maintained his aim. Don't be stupid, David. Don't make this harder than it has to be. You already made it as hard as possible when you murdered Jackson, David replied. When you chose corruption over justice, when you shot the most innocent soul in this room. Milo's breathing grew shallower, each exhale weaker than the last. David could feel the German shepherd's heartbeat slowing beneath his hands, the strong rhythm that had comforted him through countless sleepless nights finally faltering. Good boy, Milo, David whispered, his voice breaking. Such a good boy. Emma would be so proud of you. Ethan's resolve seemed to waver as he watched the dying dog and the grief-stricken man holding him. Even a corrupt cop retained some fragment of decency, some recognition of the bond between a man and his loyal companion. The sound of vehicles pulling up outside grew louder, doors slamming, voices shouting commands. Help was arriving, but David knew it was too late for Milo. The German shepherd's eyes were losing focus, his breathing uneven. I'm sorry, Ethan said suddenly, his voice trembling with genuine regret. I'm sorry about Milo. I'm sorry about all of it. David looked up at the man who'd once been his mentor, his chief, the man he'd respected and trusted for decades. Ethan had fallen so far from the idealistic young sergeant who'd once taught him about integrity and service. You can still do the right thing, David said quietly. Put down the gun. Confess to what you've done. Let Jackson's family finally have closure. Ethan's hand shook as he maintained his aim. Too late for that. Too many people involved. Too many lives at stake. If this comes out, it destroys everything. Milo's tail moved one final time, a faint, trembling wag that spoke of love transcending pain. The German shepherd's eyes found David's face one last time, filled with everything that made their bond sacred. Trust, loyalty, forgiveness, and the kind of love that asked for nothing in return. Milo, David whispered as the light faded from those Sophia eyes. My good boy. The German shepherd who had been Amelia's final gift. The one who pulled David back from the brink of despair, who had given him purpose and unconditional love, was gone. The silence in the cabin was profound, broken only by the wail of sirens and Ethan's labored breathing. David gently closed Milo's eyes, his hands shaking with grief and rage. When he looked up at Ethan, the chief saw something that made him step back. The broken, grieving retiree was gone, replaced by the dangerous man David had been for 30 years. The detective who never gave up on a case. The man who never let a killer walk free. Now it's personal, David said, his voice cold as steel. You killed my family. Footsteps pounded on the porch. The door burst open. Sheriff's Deputy Maria Santos and 2 Montana State Police officers rushed inside, weapons drawn. They froze at the sight, David cradling Milo's lifeless body, Ethan standing with a smoking gun, Henry wounded on the floor, and Bradley motionless near the overturned table. Drop your weapon, Santos commanded, her service pistol aimed at Ethan. Everyone on the ground, now. Ethan slowly lowered his gun, the fight draining out of him as the reality of his downfall sank in. It's over, he said quietly, almost to himself. 20 years of building something and it's all over. Santos kept her weapon steady as one of the troopers secured Ethan's gun. She'd been the first to respond to Helen Morrison's frantic 911 call about gunfire at David Thompson's cabin. She'd worked with David years ago and respected his integrity. "David, are you injured?" Santos asked, noticing the blood covering his shirt. "It's Milo's blood," David replied, his voice hollow with grief. "Ethan shot him. Milo died protecting me." Helen Morrison appeared in the doorway, her face pale with shock. She'd waited outside while officers secured the scene, but the sight of David holding his dead dog brought tears to her eyes. "Oh, David, I'm so sorry." Ethan looked at her with something close to shame. "Helen, Jackson was a good man, a good cop. He didn't deserve what happened." "What did happen to him?" Helen demanded, her voice trembling but strong. "Tell me the truth, Thomas. After 15 years, I deserve the truth." David gently laid Milo's body on the floor, his hands shaking as he closed the dog's eyes one final time. When he looked up, his expression carried the weight of accumulated grief, and the cold promise of justice finally served. "Jackson discovered Chief Ethan was protecting a drug operation," David said, his voice steady despite the pain in his chest. "When Jackson threatened to expose the corruption, Ethan killed him and hid his body inside that oak tree on my property." Helen's knees nearly buckled as the words hit her. You killed my husband. You killed Jackson." Ethan nodded slowly, the admission aging him decades and moments. Jackson was going to destroy everything. The operation funded community programs, department equipment, improvements throughout Cedar Falls. He couldn't see the bigger picture. The bigger picture? Helen's voice rose to a near scream. "You murdered my husband for drug money. And you call it the bigger picture?" Santos' body camera was recording every word, preserving Ethan's confession. "Chief Ethan," she said, her tone firm, "you're under arrest for the murder of Detective Jackson Morrison." As Santos read him his rights, David stood on unsteady legs. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him hollow and exhausted. Milo's death had torn open wounds that had barely healed since losing Rose and Emma. The German shepherd had been his anchor, his family, his reason to keep living when everything else had fallen apart. "David," Santos said gently, "we're going to need a full statement. But first, let's get you checked by the paramedics." "I'm fine," David replied automatically, though his voice betrayed the tremor of emotion beneath the words. He looked down at the lifeless body of his loyal companion. "Milo took the bullet meant for me. He saved my life." Helen Morrison moved closer, her eyes fixed on the fallen German shepherd. "Jackson would have done the same thing," she whispered softly. "He would have protected you just like Milo did." The parallel struck David with devastating clarity. Both Jackson and Milo had died protecting others, sacrificing themselves for the people they loved. Both had shown the kind of courage and loyalty that felt increasingly rare in a world compromised by convenience and corruption. As the paramedics arrived to treat Henry's wounds and examine Bradley, unconscious but still alive, David found his thoughts drifting to Amelia, final words about getting a dog. Somehow, she had known he would need Milo's loyalty and love to survive the years of grief and isolation that lay ahead. "We found Jackson's remains in the oak tree," David told Helen quietly, pulling Jackson's badge from his jacket pocket. "Ethan and his people have been watching me, waiting to see if I discover the truth." Helen took the badge with trembling hands, her fingers tracing the familiar number 247 she'd memorized over 8 years of marriage. "He kept it," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "After all these years, Thomas kept Jackson's badge." Ethan, now handcuffed and seated on David's couch, looked up with something approaching remorse. "I kept all their badges, Jackson, Officer Martinez, Detective Fuller. I told myself it was to honor their service, but I think I kept them because I couldn't forget what I'd done." His admission revealed the staggering scope of his crimes. 3 other officers had died over the years, all silenced for threatening to expose the corruption that had poisoned the Cedar Falls Police Department. David realized he'd been living and working beside a man who had used his position to eliminate anyone who dared challenge him. A serial killer hiding behind a badge. Santos coordinated with the state police, and the FBI agents now flooding the scene. The corruption case will require federal intervention, given the depth of local law enforcement's involvement. David's once peaceful cabin had become a crime scene processing center, with investigators photographing evidence and taking statements as the Montana sun climbed higher. Mr. Thompson, said FBI agent Patricia Sullivan, arriving within hours of the incident. We've been investigating rumors of corruption in this region for months. Your discovery of Detective Morrison's remains maybe the breakthrough we needed. David's eyes drifted toward Milo's body, still lying where he placed him on the wooden floor. Milo found him, he said quietly. Milo led me to that tree. He warned me about the danger. He died because he wouldn't let them hurt me. Agent Sullivan followed his gaze, her expression softening. Your dog was a hero, Mr. Thompson. His sacrifice exposed a criminal conspiracy that's been operating for 15 years. As the day wore on, the full scope of Ethan's operation became clear. Drug money had indeed funded community improvements, but it also lined the pockets of corrupt officials throughout Cedar Falls. The investigation would ultimately implicate dozens of people, city council members, business leaders, and law enforcement officers who had profited from the deception. Helen Morrison sat beside David on his front porch while investigators processed the scene inside. Both were emotionally drained, bound by shared grief that stretched across decades. Yet amid the sorrow, there was also relief. Finally, the truth had been revealed. Jackson can finally rest in peace, Helen said softly, clutching her husband's badge. And you can too, David, knowing you brought his killer to justice. David looked toward the oak tree, where Milo had made his final discovery. Milo deserves the credit, he said. He never stopped protecting his family, right up until the end. The sun dipped behind the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. For the first time since losing Rose and Emma, David felt something close to peace. Justice had been served, truth had triumphed, and Milo's sacrifice carried meaning that would endure long after the ache of loss began to fade. The German shepherd, Amelia's final gift, had completed his mission, protecting his master and exposing corruption that had stolen so many innocent lives. 6 months later, David Thompson stood before a crowd of more than 300 people gathered in Cedar Falls Memorial Park. Beside him stood a bronze statue of a German shepherd in a protective stance, eyes alert, body poised as if guarding something precious. The inscription read, Milo Thompson, loyalty, courage, truth, a hero who gave everything to protect his family and expose corruption. The Milo Thompson Memorial K-9 Training Center had been funded entirely by the reward money from solving Jackson Morrison's murder case. The facility would train police dogs and pair them with officers throughout Montana, ensuring the bond between humans and their canine partners would continue Milo's legacy of protection and service. Helen Morrison stepped forward to speak, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. Milo didn't just save David that day, she said. He saved our entire community by exposing the corruption that had poisoned our police department for 15 years. My husband, Jackson, would have been proud to serve alongside such a courageous partner. David felt a small weight press against his leg and looked down. A 10-week-old German shepherd puppy was striking Sophia, eyes stared up at him. The pup, named Junior, had the same intelligent gaze, the same instinctive alertness that had defined Milo from the beginning. Junior wasn't a replacement. No dog could ever fill that void. But he represented hope, continuity, and the promise of healing. Chief Ethan and his co-conspirators had received lengthy federal prison sentences. The investigation had ultimately implicated 17 people, city officials, business leaders, and law enforcement personnel. Their drug operation was dismantled, assets seized, and repurposed to fund legitimate community programs. More importantly, investigators discovered 3 additional victims beyond Jackson Morrison. Officers Martinez, Fuller, and Detective Rose Chin. Each had been murdered for threatening to expose the truth. Their families finally had closure, their names clear of suspicion or disgrace. David had since been asked to consult on similar cold cases throughout the region. His experience uncovering Jackson's murder, combined with his decades of investigative skill, made him invaluable to agencies confronting corruption. The work gave him purpose and kept Milo's memory alive through continued service to justice. The bond between a human and their dog teaches us about unconditional love. David said during his address to the crowd, Milo never asked what was in it for him. He never calculated the cost of loyalty. He simply loved completely and protected fearlessly, right up until his final breath. Junior barked once, as if understanding the moment. The crowd laughed softly, touched by the timing. After the ceremony, Agent Sullivan approached David. We've already received requests from 3 other states for your assistance with similar cases. The Milo Thompson Foundation could become a national resource for exposing institutional wrongdoing. David considered the offer, watching Junior bound to Memorial Park with boundless puppy energy. The young shepherd's curiosity reminded him so much of Milo in his early days, when every shadow was a mystery to solve and every stranger a potential friend to protect. Milo taught me that some crossings change you forever, David replied quietly. You can't go back to who you were before, but sometimes that's exactly where you're meant to be. The ceremony concluded with the release of 17 white doves, one for each year that Jackson Morrison's family had waited for answers. As the birds soared into the vast Montana sky, David felt a sense of completion that had eluded him since losing Rose and Emma. Milo's sacrifice had given meaning to every loss, transforming grief into purpose. That evening, David sat on his rebuilt cabin porch with Junior sprawled across his feet. The oak tree where Jackson's body had been found was now marked with simple plaque, in memory of Detective Jackson Morrison and all who seek truth in darkness. The tree had healed from the investigative cuts, new bark growing over the scars. The plaque ensured Jackson's story and Milo's would never be forgotten. Helen Morrison had become a regular visitor, often bringing her grandchildren to play with Junior, while she and David shared quiet memories of their loved ones. The friendship forged in tragedy had evolved into something sustaining, something deeply healing. Milo would be proud, Helen said one afternoon, watching Junior attempt to herd her grandson around the yard. He'd see that his sacrifice mattered, that it led to justice and peace. David nodded, smiling as Junior's sharp instincts kicked in. The young shepherd already showed remarkable intelligence and courage, traits that promised he would carry on Milo's legacy of service and devotion. The investigation had later revealed that Milo's ability to detect Jackson's remains wasn't supernatural, but biological. German shepherds possessed extraordinary scenting abilities. Milo had likely sensed the chemical changes in the soil around the oak tree caused by decomposition. His training and his unwavering connection to David had made him the perfect partner to uncover long-buried secrets. As winter approached, David reflected on the transformation of his life. He had emerged from isolation to become an advocate for justice. His cabin, once a place of grief, had become a space for healing and renewal. Most importantly, he'd learned that love doesn't die with loss. It continues to the lives touched and the legacies left behind. Junior raised his head, ears pricked toward the forest. The same alertness, the same instinct that once defined Milo's vigilance. David smiled, recognizing the rhythm of protection running through generations. What do you hear, boy? He asked softly. Junior relaxed again, satisfied that whatever he'd sensed posed no threat to his new family. The first evening star appeared in the darkening Montana sky, and David remembered Amelia's belief that when people die, they become stars watching over those they love. He looked up and whispered, "Keep watching over us, Emma, and you too, Milo." The wind rustled through the pines, soft and familiar, like a loyal friend's promise that love endures beyond all endings. Even when a hero's journey ends, their spirit doesn't fade. It becomes a light that guides others forward. David liked to think that Milo had joined Rose and Emma in that celestial circle of protection, their combined love forming a constellation of guardianship over the years he had left. Letters continued to pour in from families of missing persons across the country, people who clung to hope that Milo's story might lead to breakthroughs in their own unsolved tragedies. The Milo Thompson Foundation was now processing dozens of requests for assistance, building a nationwide network of investigators devoted to finding truth in even the coldest cases. David knew his grief for Milo would never fully disappear, just as his love for Rose and Emma remained steadfast despite their absence. Yet, over time, the pain had transformed into purpose, the loss into legacy, and the ending into a new beginning. one defined by service to others who walk through similar darkness. Junior stirred against his feet, settling into that familiar, comforting weight, a silent expression of a dog's complete trust in his human. The gesture reminded David of those long, lonely nights when Milo's warmth had been the only thing keeping despair at bay. The cycle continued, love freely given, loyalty rewarded with protection, and sacrifice reborn into meaning. Milo's story would live on, inspiring new partnerships between humans and dogs, new investigations into long-forgotten truths, and new victories of justice over corruption. As the Montana stars began to shimmer across the open sky, David felt peace gently settle over his healing heart. Milo's mission was complete, but his legacy was eternal. It would endure in every case solved, every family reunited with truth, and every unbreakable bond formed between a human and a dog in service of something greater than themselves. Friends, this story reminds us that even in our later years, we can still make a difference. David Thompson, at 58, had lost everything: his wife, his daughter, his very sense of purpose. Yet through Milo's unwavering loyalty and courage, he found the strength to seek justice and rebuild a life filled with meaning. This story speaks to all of us who have faced loss, betrayal, or that haunting belief that our best days are behind us. The truth is, your wisdom and experience are exactly what this world needs. Like David, you have the power to stand up for what's right, to protect the innocent, and to leave behind a legacy that truly matters. Milo's sacrifice reminds us that love transcends death, that courage wears many forms, and that sometimes our most important mission begins right when we think our story is over. So remember, your next chapter could be your most significant one yet. Paw Prints, have you ever had a pet whose loyalty and love helped you through your darkest moments? Fire what cause or injustice would drive you to take action, no matter your age. Speech balloons share your stories of loyalty, courage, and second chances in the comments below. Your words can inspire someone else to rediscover their own path to purpose. Because sometimes the greatest heroes don't wear badges or uniforms. They walk beside us on four paws, leaving paw prints that never fade.